Continuing with part 5 of Benedict's Omega Testament. I said to myself, he is the destroyer of the church, and it is clear that he was under the influence of Satan. Then my thoughts flew to Fatima, and tears came to my eyes. I was sure that my days were numbered, and that the curtain of my life would soon fall. The person responsible for shortening those days was my jailer, my seemingly loyal secretary, Gan Swain. This task had been entrusted to him, and he had to fulfill it without leaving the slightest suspicion of murder. The day before my death, my secretary received a phone call. It was Francis, and he said this phrase, "It's time," and he hung up. I had heard it because he was near me, and I thought I was asleep. I did not resist my executioner. I waited patiently for my end. What else could I have said or done, since I was completely isolated and guarded 24 hours a day, since they were really in charge within the Vatican, and they, who are now in the majority thanks to Francis, manipulated information and published a truth that was modified and generously paid by the Vatican itself. It is no secret that throughout history many popes were murdered and poisoned by the same Masonic cardinals who had infiltrated the central government. After they became secretaries of state, many of these murders were dismissed as natural death or heart attack, and to dispel any suspicion they were canonized. To name just one example, the files of Pope John Paul I and the great John Paul II, on whom they had made several failed assassination attempts, and who was eventually silenced with an unnecessary and conveniently performed laryngectomy. Finally, I am here, and I can assure you that there are many ways to kill. His gaze was a glimpse into infinity, that of Benedict XVI. I couldn't believe, Sister Benedicta says, what I heard. I felt a great pain in my heart and a great indignation. But there I was, sitting on the edge of the bed in complete silence, writing as if I were the Pope's secretary, and saying to myself, "What a horror, my God, what a lowness." Then the Holy Father looked at me and said, "Be strong and keep writing. I still have a lot to say. All of this is already part of the story. Write, daughter." I said, "I listen to you, Holy Father," and he went on. "As Pope, I always wore the white soutane, hoping that the world would realize that I had never resigned and that I was under pressure to act and make decisions for the good of the Church. In the few conversations I could have, I always expressed myself in a veiled way, so as not to arouse the suspicion of my enemies who were constantly watching me. And I had to be very careful. My enemies were numerous, and I had many microphones. Now I enjoy great peace, for God is righteous, and he always chooses the right time. These are times when many think they own and know the truth. The truth is only one, Christ, and to him alone we must always remain faithful, even if it costs us life, as it does with me. On December the 8th, 2022, with a gesture of confidence and goodwill, I informed my secretary that I had written several letters, and my last encyclical, Mary, co-redemptrix, mediatrix and advocate. I said this strongly encouraged by my predecessor, the great John Paul II, a faithful defender of Mary, co-redemptrix at the foot of the cross. I told my secretary where they were. His surprise was not long in coming. He told me, "Letters?" And at the same time he told me with an obligatory smile that he thanked me for the vote of confidence. I pointed out to him that these letters were confidential and addressed mainly to the central government, the Curia of the Vatican, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and the Liturgy, the College of Cardinals, Cardinals Gerhard Ludwig Miller, Raymond Leo Burke, Cardinal Zen, and Cardinal Robert Serra, the priestly fraternity of St. Pius X and St. Peter. I wrote a letter to priests and seminarians urging them to always strive to be exemplary priests, animated by constant and intense prayer, cultivating chastity and intimacy with Christ, and I emphasize that the priest must be conformed to the heart of Christ, and that only in this way can the priesthood be successful and bear apostolic fruit, and advise them never to be seduced by the logic of career and power, words I have often said to priests and seminarians. Finally, I urged them not to make the mistake of taking communion in hand and doing penance according to Our Lady's request. I also wrote letters to the Institutes of Consecrated Life, to journalists around the world, and to my good friend the theologian Golightly-Marshall. Finally, I addressed an open letter to the people of God. I urged Georg that these letters be published 3 days after my death, and he gave me his word. In my task of imitating Christ, who had with him to the end the treacherous and perfidious Judas Iscariot, an image of the traitors who would be seen in my church, I also had Georg, to whom I showed sincere affection, trust and patience until the last moment, desiring the well-being of his soul and his conversion, even though I knew I would soon see him commit the worst betrayal and the greatest murder, knowing that my secretary would betray me. I wisely decided to give a copy of these letters to my great friend Golightly-Marshall on his last visit, which was granted to me by a miracle of God after much supplication by my secretary Ganswain. Discreetly and without arousing suspicion, I quickly explained to Giulio what was going on, and asked him to publish these documents after my imminent death, and gave a copy to each member of the College of Cardinals, so that they in turn could make the right decisions and convene a lawful conclave after my death. Motivated by this act of trust that I showed my secretary, he secretly and treacherously communicated everything to Francis, the letters and the encyclical Mary Co-Redemptrix, which I had written, and in which I dogmatically proclaimed the co-salvation of the Mother of God. Without him noticing, and thanks to the volume of his phone, I could hear Francis give the order to burn everything, and he added, "We must not leave anything that could be compromising," to which he replied, "I will," and he hung up. He didn't know I had heard everything. Knowing of the betrayal of my secretary, Georg Ganswain, and as a last chance for him to justify himself before God, I explicitly recommended to him the encyclical I wrote on March 25, 2022. March 2022, in which after 3 years, days and nights in deep prayer and asking God to enlighten his servant with his Holy Spirit, I solemnly and dogmatically declared the roll, knowing the complete and accurate documentation that lies in the archives and accompanies this new Marian dogma, revealed to the Blessed Virgin Mary as the spiritual mother of all peoples, among her 3 main aspects as co-redemptrix, mediatrix, and advocate, which enable her to fully exercise her spiritual motherhood, a gift given to her by her Son, Jesus Christ, on the cross for all mankind of all times. The encyclical states, "The Blessed Virgin Mary is our Mother in the order of grace, co-redemptrix, mediatrix and advocate, whose motherhood is universal and has been addressed to all peoples and races since the creation of the world, beginning with the salvation accomplished by her Son, Jesus Christ. In the face of the unprecedented crisis of faith, family, society, and peace that characterizes the present state of humanity, the intercession of the Mother of God is needed today more urgently than ever. I am convinced that this papal definition of the spiritual motherhood of the Blessed Virgin Mary will be an extraordinary remedy for the current global crisis that threatens humanity, and I signed it Benedict PP, the 16th, Shepherd of Shepherds. When I finished writing this encyclical, I received a sign from heaven. In my heart I was sure my career was over. It was the last thing I would do as Pope, and from that moment on the countdown had begun. I felt at that moment like the Omega who ended a cycle in the Church and began a new and strong faith persecution. That last morning I couldn't sleep. I was breathing heavily. My sleepless nights were getting longer and longer, but I was aware that the Lord was in control. My state of mind was not the best. I felt tired and very overwhelmed by everything I knew was going on, with Francis' confession tormenting me day and night, and that I could not possibly speak given my situation, and especially the seal of confession, which is inviolable. It tormented me to cause an unprecedented scandal. My communication with the world was veiled. It was like a silent scream in my long and painful agony. Then came the moment when my secretary, Ganswain, came in the early morning hours. He thought I was asleep because I'd had several long nights. He was convinced that he had fooled me all those years. We had been forced to live together. To his surprise, I was awake. I prayed the rosary to my good and dear mother, my companion in this exile, Mary, the co-redemptrix. What better companion could there be than she who was always faithful to her Son, Jesus Christ, and who stood at the foot of the cross? George came up to me and said, "Your Holiness, can't you sleep? I have to give you this medicine." I was done, and God let me know it was time to go. Then I stared into his eyes. He looked at me and immediately averted his eyes. His gaze was cold, like that of a corpse. I took heart and said to him, "Georg, have you ever thought of my death?" He replied, "No, Your Holiness." I said, "You should do that and examine your conscience often. It is very healthy for the soul. Life is very short, and one day you will have to answer to God for your life." He said to me, "Your Holiness, why these words?" In a very low tone and with great difficulty breathing, I answered him, "Ganswain, you have been with me for a long time, and you do not know me yet. What you have to do, do it now, without further ado. But remember that one day you have to answer to God. Don't forget that." And we stared at each other in silence. Then my secretary was surprised and realized that I had exposed his deception and that it was he who had been deceived. Then he gave me the injection and told me in my ear, "It's time to end the farce." I was ready, and I prayed, and contrary to his wish, I had peace. That peace that only God can give the soul, and I whispered to him, "I forgive you everything from my heart." And in my agony my last words were, "Lord, I love you. You know me, and you know I love you." And I fell asleep, like someone falling asleep. in his mother's arms.